Okay, I knew there was a Mirage 3, and I knew there was a Mirage 5, and I knew the French had a lot of nukes back in the day. But when I learned there was a 4, and it was the one that carried half of those nukes, it was like the two birds, one stone version of a eureka moment. Today we're going to talk about the airborne leg of France's nuclear triad, the Mirage 4. What was never supposed to be more than a stopgap measure became a major contributor in France's ability to keep some form of pace with the world as it charged into the Cold War. And it all started with the Suez Canal crisis. After World War II was over, the Suez Canal in Egypt was the primary means of connecting the post-war remnants of the British and French empires to all their remaining overseas colonies, as well as their primary supply of oil.
Are y'all talking about oil?
To make sure they could control this region, the British had several bases located along the Suez Canal, per an agreement with the Egyptian government that would have lasted until 1956. But the Egyptians got tired of the British occupation and decided to start pushing back 5 years ahead of schedule. See, Egypt had wanted to construct a dam across the Nile River called the Aswan High Dam that would let the Egyptians remind nature that humanity is the one on top of the food chain by controlling the annual Nile floods for the first time in history. It would also improve aquatic navigation and generate massive amounts of hydroelectric power, but the project was going to cost a lot of money, like a small country's defense budget lot of money. To cover that non-military expenditure, the Egyptians had reached an agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom. The problem was, Egypt started getting a bit too friendly with Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, which were America's least favorite C-word at the time. Communist.
Death is a preferable alternative to communism.
Communism is the very definition of failure.
As a result, the US and the UK pulled out of the deal, so Egypt set about pulling the UK out of their country. Starting in October of 1951, Egyptian authorities would begin encouraging civil unrest against the British and their faculties in the area. Then in July of 1952, the Egyptian King Farouk was overthrown by a coup called the Free Officers Movement and replaced by the Revolutionary Command Council. The new council increased their demands and pressure, and by 1954, the British agreed to pull out of the Suez Canal area by June of 1956, which was ironically at about the same time they would have pulled out anyways. This move would prove to be just as much of a strategy to gain more freedom of operations as it would be to just get them out of the way, because not even a month later, Egypt's new president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, decided the canal would be the perfect source of funding for their new dam. On July 26, 1956, right after the British left, Nasser declared martial law in the area around the canal, seized the British and French Suez Canal Company, and nationalized the industry, which is a fancy way of saying hippity-hoppity, this is now our property. Britain and France would proceed to ship their pants directly to the laundromat in their diplomatic intentions towards finding a solution, because they were now worried that the oil shipments coming through the Suez Canal from the Middle East that they relied on could now be cut off with the wave of a single shaft. And when diplomatic intentions failed, they secretly hatched a plan called Operation Musketeer. And that plan could effectively be summed up as an Uno reverse card. If you're going to seize our property, we're going to seize your property. All of your property. At a minimum, Britain and France wanted to seize the canal to make sure it would continue operating in their favor, and at a maximum, the two countries wanted to straight up depose Nasser. And because they also had a grudge against Egypt, the two colonial-era powers would recruit Israel for the attack. The plan was for Israel to invade Egypt and advance towards the canal, stopping 10 miles east of it and holding down the Sinai Peninsula, presenting a seemingly legitimate threat in a false flag attack. The British and the French would then pretend to be the good guys and call on the United Nations to intervene and enforce a ceasefire with boots on the ground to take back the canal. Seems like a good deal.
I'll make that deal. How about you bitch? You make that deal?
I'd make that deal.
Damn good deal.
So they went with it. On October 29th, Israel sent 10 brigades in and swept out the Egyptian forces in the region. And then on the 5th and 6th of November, British and French forces would land at two major ports and take over the canal zone. And I don't know if they just assumed everyone would help them or just didn't wait long enough to convince everybody, because if they had the United Nations' support in the first place, they didn't have it for long. See, Eisenhower was pissed that the British and French had decided to go straight to boots on the ground without telling him. He was also aware that the colonial crapshoot would give the Soviets, who they had withdrawn from the region for the explicit purpose of opposing, an ideological foothold to gain ground in the region. And the Soviet Union was doing exactly that by threatening to drop troops in the region and rockets on London, all the while brutally suppressing an uprising in Hungary that the US had been trying to marshal resources against. After multiple UN resolutions and mounting pressure, especially from the United States, the British and French withdrew their forces on the 22nd of December, leaving sovereign ownership of the canal in Egyptian hands, Egypt more closely tied to the Soviet bloc, the British and the governing party at the time utterly humiliated, and the French with one stark realization. They Thanks to the Canal cluster screw, the French realized just because America was on their team against the Soviets didn't always mean they'd be on their team against everything. And without modern power projection, that meant the French could be pushed around by other powers in the world if their should-be backers didn't care. In other words, if the French wanted to make good and sure that they had control over their own intentions, they were gonna need top-of-the-line weapons. And the top-of-the-line weapons in this day and age were nukes. Now, France already had a program for making both clean and dirty nuclear options, aka nuclear powering and nuclear pounding, since 1945 after General Charles de Gaulle visited the US and learned of the nuclear programs in place. The French program was called the Commissariat à l'énergie atomique, or CEA, and they weren't starting this program up from a blank slate because they had scientists on their team like Henry Becquerel, and if you don't know him, I wouldn't worry too much. He's just the guy who discovered radioactivity. And if that wasn't enough, there was also Marie and Pierre Curie, you know, the people who figured out how to split the atom. And now, in light of the Suez crisis, they're about to take all that CEA progress and do whatever they want with it. If you're not picking up what I'm putting down, I'm trying to tell you that France just greenlit the next stage of their relationship with their power projection. They're tired of the missionary position, now they're going straight to the spicy stuff. It's about to get kinky in the French nuclear department because they're about to start experimenting with all the different ways they can f*** you.
Well, this just got interesting.
It's f*** you up.
Regardless of my choice of words, the French would set up a new department in the CEA, called the Direction des Applications Militaires, or DAM. Thing is, because of the fighting with their now emboldened colony of Algeria and the unstable governments that would keep coming and going, they wouldn't actually make a whole lot of progress until after Charles de Gaulle was elected president in December of 1958, and took office in January the next year. And by the following year, on February 7th, 1960, the French would finally test their first nuclear weapon, a 70-kiloton atomic bomb. And here's where I need to pause for just a moment, because the place where they tested the bomb is important. The French detonated their first A-bomb over Rajan, a town in the Algerian Sahara Desert. And Algeria wouldn't earn their independence from France until 1962. Coincidence? I think not. So to all them bagel eaters in the back who like to claim that America is the only country who's ever blown up a nuclear weapon over a country they were fighting, I may or may not have a retort.
Yeah, those bagel eaters in the back.
But that first test was convincing enough for Gaulle to continue with his intent for the development of France's own nuclear triad. And for the airborne leg of their force de frappe, he wanted a Mach 2 capable plane that could carry a single 60-kiloton nuclear bomb, and he wanted it done by 1964, within 5 years of his inauguration. However, even with surface-to-air missiles only being in their infancy, France knew that no matter how fast a bomber was, trying to walk away from kicking the Soviets in the jewels was about as survivable as getting the spicy football airmailed right to the bridge of your nose. Any plane they could make for this mission was going to have to be sent on a one-way trip, so the only real priority they could give a plane like that was making sure it could put the sun warheads on foreheads, aka minimizing the amount of time enemy planes had to intercept. So not only did the bomber need to have the range required to reach the Soviet territories and maybe make it back on a wing and a prayer, it would also have to be fast enough for the Soviets to smile for the flash as their local city takes a screenshot of them before waking up in hell's camera roll.
I'm not scared.
Oh no.
You probably shouldn't be. I don't know, mate.
And that wasn't even the end of it, because the French would continue what seems to be a neat little habit of always making things just a bit more difficult, even for their own team. Out of both secrecy and a need to replace aging platforms, they would keep changing the requirements for the plane, demanding longer legs, more potent pathfinding, and more importantly, bigger booms, slowly evolving the project over time in the direction of being a medium supersonic bomber. They also wanted more options, because this new bomber would have to take over for the old bombers, the aging SO-4050 Vautour 2s. While these planes had been the fastest thing in the world when they were made, you gotta remember this is the late 1950s and engine tech is developing so fast they're probably outpacing rabbit fortification rates. And since the Vautour could drop bombs of Scoville levels of both Salsa Verde and Carolina Reaper, the new plane would also have to be able to drop the less spicy ones when burning the souls of their enemies wasn't a mission requirement. Eventually, the French would make up their requirement mines in 1959. The bomber had to carry a 1,500 kilogram payload for 3,000 kilometers, or for those who speak moon units, roughly 3,300 pounds for over 1,800 miles. Just for reference, your average American four-door sedan weighs about that much, okay? The French wanted a bomber that could ship your average car almost 2,000 miles.
It's just like launching a Miata at somebody.
And then they wanted to cover half that distance while going faster than Mach 1.7 without mid-air refueling. Naturally, this is a pretty tall order, but this is the French we're talking about. For all the smack we Americans might talk, there are at least a few things the French do really, really well. And among those are bread, champagne, and friggin' airplanes. The French literally invented manned aviation. Seriously, on September 19th, 1783, the Montgolfier brothers were the first people to take flight ever in a hot air balloon over the city of Versailles. There is a reason that when most people with some airplane knowledge think of World War I, one of the first planes to come to mind for the Allied powers is the Spads. 7 or 13, pick your poison, doesn't matter which. I actually had the hardest time figuring out which French plane to do first on this channel because somehow I've never heard of a French plane being consistently bad. Even in the commercial aviation sector, Boeing's been turning itself into a joke, and meanwhile Airbus has just been sitting there like,
I hear nothing. Y'all hear some?
Back when Boeing's 737 started having their long list of problems, Airbus deliberately chose not to capitalize on their lack of success. And their CEO even came out and told the press that they didn't want to do it because they didn't want to destabilize the market, which I am 90% sure is just polite corporate speak for, we're not even worried about them making a comeback. There is nothing they can do to challenge us after this, so we're just going to let them get back on their feet so we can just keep beating the meat off of them all over again. Do you understand how gangster you have to be to let your enemy get back up and try to challenge you again because you know they don't stand a chance? They're just that one overpowered character who's playing with their food because they know they could end the entire show with a snap of their fingers. Needless to say, the French are pretty confident in their plane-making skills, so two companies would get to work on this new flying monster. Suez Aviation and General Aeronautique Marcel Dassault, or GAMD, later known as just Dassault Aviation. Suez proposed the SO 4060 Super Vautour, while Dassault decided to upscale a plane that was still in development, the soon-to-be famous danger Dorito known as the Mirage 3. And by upscaled, I mean they literally just made it bigger and strapped in a second engine. Bigger is better, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Basic arithmetic. Funny bit aside though, there was an advantage to just making a bigger Mirage, and that being you could double fist your research and development between both planes. There's a reason that you can get away with putting a scale mock-up in a wind tunnel and using that to test a plane's design first, because there are certain parameters that you can use to estimate all the important stuff on the big version from the small version. The two most important ones are Mach number, i.e. how many times over you can make sound want to rethink its life, and Reynolds number, which in the simplest possible terms is a comparison between how readily a fluid, such as air, moves around something compared to how viscous or sticky that air is. Basically, you can use Reynolds number to predict if the air going around your plane is all nice and neat, or if it's going all over the place and causing you enough drag to look like a Looney Tunes character with their face flapping around. So by using the Mirage 3 as a direct basis, they could apply all that test data from the scale models used to make it to the new bomber, which translates to spending less time and less money. Considering that the new Mirage, dubbed the Mirage 4A, was basically guaranteed to operate on a faster timetable and was more technologically advanced than the 4060, the GAMD prototype was chosen as the winner and put into development as a starter version of the actual bomber. And I say starter version because GAMD wanted to make the Mirage 4 bigger for the B model to increase payload capacity and range. But that got shut down pretty quick, primarily because it would have used American engines. And since relying on American parts would defeat the point of having independent nuclear capability in the first place, the B model went out the window and the A model became the plane with the plan. However, it was that demand for independence that would make GAMD's decision to rely on upscaling the Mirage 3 to save time a very wise decision. At that point in time, manufacturing and infrastructure for a lot of the parts and equipment that would be used on the Mirage 4 just didn't exist and had been outsourced to other countries, which would make their nuclear system dependent on somebody else's doctrine if they worked with those parts.
No.
Yeah, no.
So to ensure the complete and total independence of the program, France instead decided to opt out of everyone else's infrastructure and opt into building everything they needed domestically, a lot of the time from scratch and in less than 5 years. They would also need to test all those parts extensively because French research data showed that it would take 20 minutes for the friction heating of continuous supersonic flight to stabilize throughout the entire airframe and anything in it, and all of its systems would have to operate normally during that time. Plus, since the bomber would have to be an afterburner the whole time for those 20 plus minutes, it would drink fuel like a lifelong alcoholic. And despite eventually housing 3 times the Mirage 3's fuel in the fuselage, thin wings, and even the vertical tail, the 4 still wouldn't have the range to make it all the way to the Soviet Union on its own, meaning that on top of the in-house engines and on top of the extensive infrastructure and new parts, France was also going to now have to need flying gas stations. And after looking at modifying a couple of their planes, they got hit with an unusually pleasant surprise. Boeing was willing to sell France their pretty much brand new KC-135As. After some negotiations and flight tests in late 1962, a fixed refueling probe was added to the Mirage 4's nose, and in February of 1964, the French would purchase 12 stripped-down KC-135As. These were relabeled the C-135Fs, F for France and C instead of KC, because when I say stripped down, I mean the US, who still wasn't sure whose side France was even on, decided to sell them tankers without the gas tanks, effectively turning it into just another cargo plane with a refueling probe.
It's just an empty cup.
But despite all odds and all the moving and added parts, France would still get its supersonic Dorito chip. The first Mirage 4 prototype flew all the way back in 1959 on the 17th of June, and even then it was shaping up to be a monster. Not only did it reach Mach 2 on its first flight, it went past it to Mach 2.1 and then held it for 15 minutes on its first flight. And not only was it using the early Atar 9B engines, which couldn't even break 42 kilonewtons of thrust, or about 9,500 pounds, it didn't even need a whole lot of fixes for it to be ready for the next stage. It did so well that on its third test flight only 3 days later, the budding Mirage was cleared for a flyby at the Paris Air Show. The Mirage 4 was on a roll, and it wasn't slowing down, because by the end of September of 1960, the new bomber had set 2 world records. Test pilot René Begon would start the party by showing up an American fighter jet, the F-101 Voodoo, by over 400 miles an hour in speed and breaking a top speed of 1,132 miles an hour, or 1,822 metric knot miles an hour over a 1,000 kilometer circuit. 3 days later, he would go for the gold in the 500-kilometer sprint and fly between Mach 2.08 and Mach 2.14, averaging out to 1,225 miles an hour or 1,972 knot miles an hour. And somehow, all this capability still wasn't enough for the French Air Force because they wanted more range. GAMD would have to increase the length of the fuselage and the total max takeoff weight to 32 metric tons, or a bit over 70,000 pounds, before continuing testing. The French first purchased 50 of their new nuclear bombers back on May 29, 1962, and 12 additional Mirage 4s were ordered on November 4th of that same year. The additional Mirages were adapted slightly. They could dual-wield combat roles between nuclear deterrence and photo reconnaissance. Doesn't matter if it's a nuclear bomb or a photo bomb, those Mirage 4s have you covered. Sometimes called the Mirage 4Rs, these additional 12 would be able to equip the CT-52 recon pod in the inventory's nuke slot. The camera itself wouldn't enter service until 1968, but it was very flexible and could carry conventional, infrared, or thermographic cameras, earning it the joke of being the most expensive camera in France.
Smile for the camera.
The Mirage 4, on the other hand, would enter service 4 years prior in 1964, right on schedule. And if the franchise was out then, they would probably have called this thing the Star Destroyer, considering its shape. The Delta Wing was a new design for French aviation, but it definitely had its benefits. Unlike standard swept wings, a Delta Wing system is more efficient both structurally and aerodynamically, allowing planes to generate more lift with a smaller wingspan. However, to enable the high speeds desired, the wings had to be stupid thin and have a stupid high sweep angle, which for the whole Mirage family was a whopping 60 degrees. That also meant the plane needed to go faster in order to actually fly, giving it higher takeoff and landing speeds. However, they could address that with jet-assisted takeoff or JATO bottles on the way out, and those were only needed for shorter runways or warmer days because of its 2 Snecma Atar 09K engines. Each one of these put out 15,400 pounds or 6.7 thousand Isaacs and could push the plane just past Mach 2 and hold it
For 30 minutes!
Not only could this plane top sound twice over, it could do it in the amount of time it takes for an average American to take a lunch break, and it could do it safely. Every plane can have a top speed, and there were a lot that could make it to Mach 2, but holding it safely for that long is a whole different ballgame. Most planes can only maintain that high a speed for a few seconds before they shatter. The Mirage 3, the 4's smaller brother for example, could only do Mach 2 for a few minutes. The Mirage 4 would become the only combat plane in European history to hold down Mach 2 for that long. The only other plane in Europe that would ever boast that kind of speed was the Concorde, and the only things that plane carried were people. The Mirage 4 wasn't very people-friendly though, especially after it dropped the AN-11 or AN-22 nuclear gravity bomb partially sunk into its belly.
I really hate people.
Or with the conventional bombs it could carry on underwing pylons if it wasn't mounting twin 2,500-liter fuel tanks and various countermeasure pods. But when it felt like playing with fire, the 4 was supposed to fly at that supersonic speed required of it for half of its nuclear bombing journey, giving it a one-way range of over 2,000 3,000 miles, or 3,300 metric knot miles for its crew of 2 to sit through. Imagine having to hold your piss for that long. Although, to be honest, they probably wouldn't have any left in the tank if the alarm was given. The Mirage 4 would start making waves in France and the world almost immediately after entering service, especially when President Charles de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's Integrated Military Command in 1966. They were still in NATO, and their military didn't have to operate by NATO commands and restrictions, but this would also mean NATO weapons and units couldn't be deployed to France. They would still participate in military actions, but those military actions were theirs to command. And while that seems like a pretty bad idea, this decision gave France full control over the deployment of their nukes, which can be a pretty scary thing for the enemy. If you don't know how France operates, they don't follow along with the typical nuke deterrence themes. The nuclear policy of the Mirage 4 wasn't built for just bombing whatever military target the French could get closest to. No, the French nuclear policy is to skip go, do not collect $200, just go straight to Geneva. The French believed that the Soviet Union would take their domestic nuclear deterrence seriously without NATO help if their fleet of Star Destroyers could blow away 10 major cities. So what the French would do is set up 36 Mirage 4s dispersed across multiple quick reaction alert bases, no more than 4 to a base to minimize losses after a first strike, and set to 3 different alert levels: 15 minutes or A-15, 5 minutes or A-5, and AB, better known as frickin' yesterday. Typically only A5 and A15 were used, and A5 was cancelled after they brought ICBM silos online in the mid-70s. They would also frequently test the force to frap via 2 kinds of exercises. The first test was the Banco, which would test how quickly the ground crews could gas and go the bomber with a real nuke, while the second, Poker, would test the force's ability to go from fuck me to fuck you with dummy weapons mounted aboard. French peacetime policy didn't allow live nukes on live launches for obvious reasons, but let's be honest here, people are human and people make mistakes. It was only a matter of time before someone missed a spot.
Are you gonna do this right now? In front of everybody.
In either 1964 or 1965, right after the Mirage 4 entered service, there was an event where a fault in the alert system actually transmitted a full nuclear launch order to the Alert 5 crew. The crew, believing the order completely, was shocked but took off anyway with their live nuke on board. However, once airborne, the crew did not receive the follow-up order to introduce somebody to their sun god because back on the ground, everyone freaked out when they realized the orders were faulty. They would correct for it and call the bomber back to base, and eventually news of the event would reach General de Gaulle. And de Gaulle was actually very pleased. In his own words, the event, quote, proves that the system worked and that the airmen obeyed their orders without hesitating to execute their mission. While the order may not have been real, Gaulle knew that the chain reaction that followed proved that despite the country and the plane basically still being brand spanking new to the nuclear deterrence game, they were absolutely ready, and even the fail-safes had worked correctly. As far as he was concerned, it was just an excellent test.
Another happy landing.
However, what they hadn't done was actually drop the nuke, so the only thing left to stress test was whether or not they could actually crack open that sun portal. So they planned Operation Tamo to run the first live nuke drop test out of Tahiti How. Now, I didn't know where the hell Tahiti was on a map. I had to look this up. Paris to Tahiti is a 15,075 kilometer trip, literally just a few hundred shy of 10,000 miles. And that is the most direct route. It is basically on the polar opposite side of the planet. And one of those Mirage 4s flew there. A spare Mirage 4 was also shipped to the test location, disassembled, and aboard an amphibious delivery ship in case anything went wrong. Which kind of begs the question, why didn't they do it to both of them? I did say they like making things more difficult sometimes, but after 2 in-flight refuelings and over 7.5 hours of flight, on the 10th of May 1966, that Mirage 4 would earn the French some bragging rights and become the first French combat plane to cross the Atlantic Ocean and land in the United States. Even with the twin 2,500-liter tanks and an extra 1,600-liter tank in the bomb slot, they would still need 3 refueling planes and several pre-positioned Navy ships for communications, because for some reason, they didn't put a VHF radio in their bombers, so without ground guidance, they were basically flying blind, which is not what I would call a wise decision given the nearly world-ending mistake that had happened literally within the last 2 years. However, they would make it just fine from the Azores Islands to Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts, then making a pit stop in both California and Hawaii before finally making it to Tahiti. Unfortunately, after all that historic flying, the Mirage 4 that flew there would overrun the runway during a training exercise, and it had to be swapped out with a backup bomber for the actual drop. So on July 19th, the backup Mirage 4 would drop a 50-kiloton gravity nuke near the Mururoa Lagoon, and the test would be a complete success. That plane would then return to France by way of the same route as before, letting the Mirage 4 double-tap the achievement board for the first and second French combat planes to cross the Atlantic.
If you ain't first, you're last.
Unfortunately for the French, the nuclear mission the Mirage 4 was made for never became a feasible plan. Surface-to-air missiles started coming into play before the Mirage 4 entered service, and only got more and more proliferated as time went on. The French tried to compensate for this by installing and improving electronic warfare equipment in pods, but as more and more systems came online, the French eventually realized that the only thing better than dodging getting shot at was just not getting shot at. All nuclear Mirage 4s would pivot to low-altitude penetration missions for nuke delivery, and from the AN-11 gravity drop bombs to the drag-shooted AN-22 bombs. And thanks to the fact that the airplane structure could make going Mach 2 for 30 minutes look less like an achievement and more like a cheat code, it had no problem being adapted to the increased abuse of low-altitude flight, unlike its American Dorito counterpart that would start maliciously imploding due to the increased structural fatigue. But there would be a drawback of this low-altitude approach, that being the increased drag force in the denser air. This meant the Mirage 4 wouldn't have the range to do its portal spawning job anymore. So for a nuclear deterrent, the French would need a new missile, and a new Mirage 4. Starting in May of 1983 and operational in May of 1986, 18 Mirage 4As were upgraded to the Mirage 4P standard to launch ASMP nuclear cruise missiles as a stopgap until the Mirage 2000 program was ready to be certified. The ASMP was meant to be used as part of a new step in their nuclear doctrine that France still maintains to this day. And that step is a warning shot. Yes, you heard me correctly, the French have a last-ditch strategy for avoiding full-scale nuclear war that involves taking a nuclear cruise missile and putting a shot across the bow with it. This is the nuclear equivalent of intentionally missing with the gun you have pointed at someone's head for the sole purpose of letting them know that playtime is over and you will pull the trigger. Because the only thing more dangerous than two people who can end the world at the drop of a hat is a third person who will actually drop that hat. Forget mutually assured destruction, this is mutually aided destruction. France isn't gonna kill the planet, they're just gonna help everyone else get the ball rolling. I'm trying to tell you that the Mirage 4 just went from Star Destroyer to Death Star. Now, the Mirage 4 would never lash out at anything in anger, but it would be used extensively for long-range reconnaissance and battle damage assessments. And even one case where a 4 brought back pictures of a Soviet Krivok-class frigate with some graffiti on a smoke detector panel that read, "This ship is a latrine." But the funniest story of the Mirage 4 occurred on June 26, 1973, when USSR First Secretary Leonid Brezhnev paid a follow-up diplomatic visit to France and President Georges Pompidou. A few years earlier, Pompidou had been invited by Brezhnev to visit the Soviet Strategic Command, and at one point during the tour, Brezhnev casually asks Pompidou to push a button, which he does. Brezhnev then looks at him and jokingly goes, "Good job, you just destroyed France." As you might have guessed, Pompidou was not very happy with that joke, and when he returned home, he was looking for a way to get back at him when he came to France. And on the day of the state dinner, there just so happened to be a Mirage 4 returning from a classified Circus maritime recon mission to track Soviet ships. That just so happened to have gotten pictures of a surfaced Soviet submarine with its crew sunbathing and playing cards. It took virtually zero time for them to compile a full scrapbook of all those pictures with foreign relations managing comments attached. And I would have paid to see the look on that man's face when Pompidou presented it to him at the state dinner.
He spun that monitor around like,
However, the legacy of the original Mirages could not last forever, but it still wasn't until June of 2005 that the French government decided to end the aircraft's career, leaving some of these planes to the museum yards and others to the scrap yards. So in summation, if you ever see one of these Dorito winged wonders, just remember something. Don't underestimate those French planes. They might just draw you like one of their French girls, because I'm pretty sure you have to be in your birthday suit to meet God. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.